you mind if we shift gears just a little bit?
Yeah, let's go for it.
So I wanted to talk about, this is a topic that hails back to when I was your PhD student.
Oh my goodness.
When there was an uproar, or there was a thing about DNA in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, think about DNA Book of Mormon.
And I know that you haven't really dealt with this for a long time.
Yeah.
There's other people, Ugo Perego and others have been dealing with this. But I'd like you to talk about what was your strategy for dealing with that when it came up. Maybe just tell a little bit that story.
Yeah.
And what was your strategy for dealing with it? Because I thought it was brilliant.
So I recognized early on, even when I was a graduate student, that this was going to be an issue. That there was going to come a day when someone would say, hey, DNA evidence that we see in humans seems to suggest that the narrative in the Book of Mormon might not be true. Now, part of this has to deal with a lot of theoretical ideas within the field of phylogenetic systematics and what DNA can be useful for in terms of understanding the past and where it can mislead us.
Mm-hmm.
And I was well acquainted with a lot of those theoretical arguments. When the call was first put out by a fellow up in Oregon or Washington, I can't even remember his name. It was 20 years ago. It's
Murphy or something,
been 2 decades, something like that. That there was this announcement, and it came out in the media that there was someone who had scientific proof that the Book of Mormon was not true, and it was based on DNA. Well, I perked up my ears, listened to what this fellow had to say, and the first thing which was readily apparent is that this person never had a course in evolutionary biology. Because what you recognize is the way DNA moves around in populations through time, and how those populations interact as groups, and how DNA interacts within species is an incredibly complicated thing.
Right.
And we've developed a lot of tools to try and understand that. Excuse me. And in the last 20 years, we've developed even more tools. But in order to use DNA to make these sorts of pronouncements, there are a large number of underlying assumptions which must be met.
Mm-hmm.
And what I point out, and I did this, and I think this was the first article which had to deal with DNA.
I believe so, yeah.
What I point out is this long list of assumptions and how hard it is for the Book of Mormon narrative to fit within those assumptions. So what I was not challenging was the notion that the DNA signature in Native Americans does not closely match the DNA signatures of people from the Middle East.
Right.
Because that clearly was true. What I was pointing out is that there are many, many reasons why we would expect that to be the case. In fact, we would have been shocked to have found that the Native American signature matches identically with what we see in the Middle East today. That would not have made sense from an evolutionary standpoint. So I looked at it where I knew an awful lot about insects and insect DNA and insect evolution, and I didn't care that the species was Homo sapiens.
Right.
I simply looked at it and said, well, how do we interpret DNA information? And that was the focus of that paper.
I remember one thing that I loved about that was you said, the argument was, what grant proposal would I have to create in order to get funded? And would it get funded? Like, would they even consider it?
Yeah.
And I thought that was brilliant, because it was like, well, here's what I would have to try to assume, right, with all these assumptions, and here's the model I'd have to build. And you showed that basically it would be really, really difficult, and you wouldn't get funded because you couldn't demonstrate neither here nor there.
Yeah, it would be, looking at it as an NSF program director, if someone put in a proposal saying, I want you to fund me to test the authenticity of the Book of Mormon via DNA, I would look at it and say, well, given this system, can we meet these assumptions?
Right.
And we do this all the time at NSF. And we turn all these proposals down where people say, I'll use DNA to do this amazing thing or that amazing thing. And specialists look at it and say, well, you know what? You actually can't do it because you can't satisfy this whole list of assumptions given this case.
In that, I'll never forget in your presentation when you were teaching about evolution, you used gumballs as an example. And every time my wife and I are like in the mall and we walk by a gumball machine, we always look at each other and go, Mike Whiting.
Mike Whiting, gumballs, yeah.
Gumballs.
Well, I am glad that as you have sat at my feet of wisdom and knowledge, what you have walked away with is an appreciation for gumballs.
Exactly, gumballs.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you haven't dealt with that, but you haven't dealt with that since really that time, right?
No. And one of the reasons is there's a recognition on my part. I'm a phylogenetic systematist. We are interested in how species are related to each other, in the dynamics of how species evolve, and we can use DNA to do that. There's a different field called population genetics, and population genetics uses a different set of tools. I am not a population geneticist. I knew I wasn't. I know about population genetics, but I never wanted to portray myself as someone who was the expert to go to on these issues.
Right. Yeah.
And so that was the reason why I kind of said my piece, and I haven't further engaged in it because I don't have anything else to add to the discussion.
Do you think that your, that initial response, and I think that didn't the church kind of come to you and ask you to do this, or someone?
At the time, I met with the university president when this came out.
Yeah.
He came over. President Bateman sat down and met with me in my office.
Okay, so there was kind of an ask.
So it was kind of an ask, but it was sort of the kind of something I was doing anyway.
Okay. Because what I'm getting at is then not too long after, they changed the introduction in the Book of Mormon.
They did.
Do you think that, did your reasoning have a role, do you think, maybe with that?
I think it did.
Okay.
I think it became really clear from what I wrote and what others had written on the subject. Right.
Yeah.
I think it became very clear that it was hard you don't want to nail the Book of Mormon to a statement which was not originally within the Book of Mormon, which associated the descendants of Laman and Lemuel with the American Indians,
right.
with Native American Indians, right? And so they changed that. They took it out.
Yeah, I was really pleased when the change happened too, because for me, that's the kind of pattern I want to keep seeing in the church, is when something has been demonstrated, we should accept it with joy, right?
Sure,
like the 1910 statement says. And that was a good example where it was demonstrated that the way that introduction was written was not correct, and it needed to be amended.
Yeah, and they did that. Have you seen, you've seen this with death.
Yeah.
You've seen how if you take a look at your printed scriptures and you look in the top and you look in the Bible dictionary under death, and it has a discussion of death and death before the fall, how if you take a look at the online version of the Bible dictionary, that's changed now. So what it does is it gets rid of this notion that nothing died prior to the time of Adam and Eve,
right. which
which was in the original version and now has been removed.
Right. So we see these kind of, I don't know if we call them baby steps or whatever they are,
Yep.
but I like the pattern that the church recognizes that expert experiences in the sciences, when something has been demonstrated, even if it goes against something that maybe was a long-held tradition, we need to move in that direction. Sure. It seems like that's a positive thing, and I'm glad that sometimes I wish the church would move more quickly.
Sure. Well, because there's many issues, right? There's many. So when I started at BYU, evolution was a hot button topic. Mm-hmm. Everybody was afraid that people were losing their testimonies, were leaving the church over evolution. Administration was really concerned what we were doing with it. Brethren in Salt Lake were really concerned. That was the issue.
Right.
Evolution is not that issue anymore. There are still people who are concerned with it. But there are other issues that our students face, which in many ways are more difficult to handle or more deeply ingrained, and which really cut people to their core. And these sorts of issues that our students are struggling with, and science has an awful lot to say about these issues, and the church has been a bit slow in making those sorts of baby steps. Yeah, I think I get what you're talking about.